Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Chris Bates. I'm joined in the, online here with Amy Lunardi. How are you doing, Amy?
I'm good, Chris. How are you?
If you haven't listened to any of our episodes, we're hoping to become Australia's most trusted podcast, property podcast, that is. Today, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the murky world of off the plan. And, you know, what is it? How does it work? What are some of the positives? What are some of the negatives? What are some of the risks? So it's going to be a really good chat today. And Amy and I come from different worlds, I guess. I come from the lending side, and I've seen all sorts of issues in this sort of type of investing. And Amy on the other side, on the property asset side, you know, she's got a lot of insights in what she's seen in client stories. So we're going to have lots of different conversations around little anecdotes, where it's gone well, when it hasn't gone well. So before we get, you know, into the guts of it, Amy, what is off the plan, right? There's a big misconception of, you know, what type of property you can buy under it and how it all works.
Yeah, so the most common type of off-the-plan property is one that hasn't yet been built. That being said, technically, an off-the-plan property could be also at various stages of construction. It might be 10% complete, 80% complete. It also, in some situations, can be fully complete, but it's still technically off the plan because that plan of subdivision hasn't registered. And that's the very last step that happens before you can go and settle. And it is important to understand, if you're buying a brand new property, if that plan of subdivision has been registered yet, because there can actually be delays in that process, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the most common situation with off the plan is not yet constructed at all. So what you're really buying is something based on some plans that you have been provided with.
Yeah, some plans, some beautiful renders, a beautiful website, maybe a display suite on a high street somewhere where it's, you know, selling you the lifestyle of how beautiful this home may be one day. And there's issues in that itself, you know. There's potentially what they offer you and they promise may not be exactly the way they finish it. You know, the fixtures, fittings, the sizes, there's all sorts of issues there to sort of unravel. But you know, what's the sort of process, right? So generally, you know, this isn't just high-rise apartments. I think that we should make that clear. It could be medium density. It could be a small block of 6 units. It could be townhouses, you know, maybe a row of 3 or 4 townhouses, or even just a duplex. But we're not talking about sort of greenfield, new house and land packages that you buy the land and then you appoint a builder and you build the house yourself. That's a complete other sort of type of investing that we're not talking about today. It's really where people go into sign up for something that hasn't been built, usually more higher density, or, you know, more of a dense, you know, multiple dwelling situation. And it's going to take many years for that to be built. What's the sort of process that is that people should expect after they sort of buy something off the plan?
Yeah, well, the key difference, just like you've touched on there, Chris, we're not talking about house and land. And the key difference here is off the plan is still one contract. It's one contract that you're entering to purchase that property. And then that developer or that builder is going to build that property, and you're not having to get separate construction finance or anything like that. So one loan and one contract, in comparison to if you're purchasing land and then constructing a building on it. So kind of like a house and land situation, that's one loan and one contract for the land. And then you have to go and find a builder and have a separate loan for that and a separate contract. So with off the plan, a little bit more straightforward, but not without risk. And when you're purchasing off the plan, Chris, you're right in that you might have, or you might be given these brochures and floor plans and renders, which are essentially computer generated images of what that property could look like, including the interiors and exteriors, sometimes display suites. Sometimes you might not get very good information at all. It really depends on the marketing budget of that particular developer. But why you might consider off the plan sometimes is that it can give you some more choice. So you might be looking to purchase in a particular area, and there could be a couple of new developments going up. And for whatever reason, you might say, well, this actually suits my timeline. This suits my criteria. These properties are in the right location. They're ticking the right kind of boxes. So in which case, it may give you more opportunities than just considering established properties.
Yeah, I think you're right. What we've seen sometimes with clients is they've become a bit fed up in the market, right? They've been going to open homes, they've been going to auctions. They've maybe been taken for a bit of a ride by some agents. They thought they had a property and it was all going to happen, then it fell over. And they're just fed up. They get exhausted. And what ends up happening is they see a display suite and they're like, walk in, and then all of a sudden they're getting this, free sparkling water, and it's getting this beautiful renders are getting thrown to them. And then they're getting promised that they're getting a really good deal and maybe, an extra special one of the apartments, and they're getting thrown all these extras like, these features and fittings. And they're like, this just sounds amazing. You only have to put $1,000 deposit down today. And then you just got to put an extra $5 grand down next week, or 10% down next week. And I think that's what happens is that a lot of the off the plan sector, especially if they're selling it to home buyers and a lot of first home buyers, is it's easier to buy because it's just like a beautiful experience sitting down, picking your apartment, picking your fixtures and fittings, versus the pain it is going to auctions, going to open homes, doing building and pests, saying no to properties, negotiating with agents. And that's not a reason to do it, but that is definitely one of the motivations I find with buyers, is that they go there because it's less painful.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you are looking at buying into one of those larger blocks, you might have your pick, especially at the very start when not all of them have been snapped up. So, you might get to choose which side of the block you want to be on, or the best orientation or the best layout for you, et cetera. And that can be appealing. And some of the plan properties, not all of them, but some will allow you to make little customizations. For example, choosing the internal color scheme, sometimes changing a wall here and there, nothing major, nothing too structural. But it can give you that little bit of an element of being able to tailor that property to yourself. And for some buyers as well, the idea of buying something which is brand new and they're that first owner and no one else has lived in that property, they can really like that idea too, in the same way that sometimes people prefer to buy brand new cars. Though in the same way that a brand new car depreciates the first minute that you drive it out of the showroom, sometimes off the plan properties can do that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll talk a bit more about that in detail, but I agree with you. That's definitely one of the things that entices people to buy off the plan, is that feeling of it being new, right? It's like, you get a new car and you get the bow on top of it. It's like when you settle on off the plan, everything's fresh. There's nothing to do. There's often is things to do. There's defects that they're trying to fix. They haven't painted there. They've damaged the cupboards. The taps aren't right, etc. There's usually things that are happening, to be honest, with builds, but ultimately it's you're buying something that feels brand new. And I think that entices a lot of buyers to it, because there's this no need to do a renovation, which when you're buying established property, often there's a list of things you want to do to it, but things also you need to do. That's potentially one of the big draw cards, right? The easy to buy, buying something new, maybe you can tailor it. The other benefit we see with the off the plan space is you can potentially buy it at today's prices. And hopefully that's a good price for when this thing finally settles in a few years' time and it's being built. And like you say, they've got all the land registers being sort of updated, and you've got a building certificate, etc. That's actually a good price you purchased at, even though you purchased it sort of 3 years ago. But this can go both ways, can't it, Amy?
It can go both ways. So what that means is when you're purchasing now, you're purchasing at today's price. And with an off-the-plan property, that completion or that final time when it's built and you can settle and move in, that might be quite a while in the future. If it was a boutique townhouse complex, it might be, say, 1 year away. But for these larger apartment blocks, this can be many, many years down the track. And further to that, quite often there are delays. There are delays to the build. There are delays outside of your control. So if the market goes up in the meantime, well, that's a bit of a win for you because you've purchased at today's price. But we all know that the market doesn't always go up. And if it goes down, then that can be a huge problem for you. And this can sometimes happen for, reasons which you can't foresee the market changing, but also especially if you're buying into an area where more subdivisions are happening. So maybe yours is the only apartment block going up in that particular spot right now, but over the next few years, more get built. And that can actually devalue your property and you have less scarcity of that property too.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is clients will come to us and get pre-approval and we say you can borrow X amount today. They go into the established market. So that's one of the other 11 million dwellings out there. And they try to buy. And if they bought one of those properties, they could get financed today, right? Because that property would settle in, 30, 60, 90 days or something, right? The problem with off the plan is that what you can borrow today may not be what you can borrow in 3 years' time. So one of the big negatives around the off the plan space is when clients come to us, okay, in 2022, they could borrow $1 million. They settle on the property in 2024 and they can only borrow $600,000, whether that's changes to bank policy or they're not working or they started a business, etc. We find that it can be a real issue, especially if you look at the last 12 months. Borrowers could have borrowed 35 to 40% more last year. So if they signed up to an off-the-plan contract in 2021, they would be unlikely to borrow that money in 2022 or 2023 probably. So I think and the other thing I guess with the lending is that you only get a valuation on the property when it's finished. So what matters is not what you pay for it today, but what's that property going to be worth when it finishes? And that's what a bank will lend on. And what you can see is very publicized in apartment markets in Melbourne and Brisbane in particular, is that the bank wouldn't value it what you purchased at. So you might have bought it at 500,000, but the bank val came in at 450, and they would only lend 80% on that, let's say, rather than 80% on the 500,000 that you agreed to pay the developer. And it creates this real big shortfall. It's called a settlement risk. And that's going to be really common in the next couple of years. You think the off-the-plan sector does really well when there's real desperation and buyers are very, looking for alternative options than buying in the actual market. And so a lot of people bought off the plan in 2021, for example, but those properties aren't getting completed till 2022, 2023, 2024. So that's just something to be really mindful of, is the settlement risk. A, maybe because you can't borrow the money, but B, because the valuation comes in lower.
Yeah, and the issue around, purchasing now, but this property not being able to settle for a couple of years, it exposes yourself to so much risk because so much can change from, like you said, the finance perspective. Your income position could change, banking policy could change, so many things which are beyond your control and you can't foresee. And also your own personal situation could change. You might, a couple of years down the track, say, well, no, this is not representative of my current lifestyle needs anymore. But you'll still then need to have to go through with that purchase unless you can on-sell it. And that's a whole separate story. That is easier said than done. So because things can change so much, you can, in theory, put yourself in as best position as you can with finance by having as big of a buffer as you can, saving up in the meantime, just in case you have a bank valuation shortfall. Just say that property is valued at $50,000 less than what you paid, or $100,000. What would you do in that instance? Speak to your mortgage broker. Is that an acceptable risk for you? What would your backup plans be? What would your contingencies be? And then building up a buffer in the meantime, just in case that happens. So you can't be subject to finance when it comes to off the plan. The developer or the agent is not going to let you have a 2-year subject to finance clause. So in which case you are taking a lot of risk when it comes to finance and off the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even your lifestyle, in terms of, you might have a partner now in the future, you might not be with the partner when you first signed the contract, and you are liable for not only the stamp duty and settle and losing your deposit. There's potentially also, you're liable if the developer can't sell that property, and there's all these other legal issues that can come down the line. If you decide to walk away, you're not potentially just walking away from your 10% deposit. It's a bit of an unknown. Developers in some situations would try to come to you for what they can sell it at in the future. And while it's rare, it's in the contract. And one of the things I think people sometimes think is, okay, well, if in 2 years' time I've signed this contract and I don't want to go ahead with it, I'll just get out of it and I'll sell it to someone else. But a lot of developers have contracts that don't allow you to on-sell that property. You're not allowed to give this to somebody else until it settles, because what they want to do is stop anyone creating new prices for the value of those properties between now, when they first sign the contract, and when it settles, in case people are selling properties for much under what they're getting sold, being sold for, and create valuation issues. So they're not easy to get out of these contracts. Each developer's got their own contract, so you need to be really mindful on that and get some great legal advice if you're considering it. It's the same for investors. These aren't just first home buyers. You know, a lot of downsizers play in this space, to be honest, and a lot of investors play in this space. And what we've seen is investors actually get sign up to these off the plan, and it takes years for them to realize it was not the best decision, but they're stuck. They can't do anything else. They can't sell it. So they have to settle on it, and it's taking years and years. So they have this huge opportunity cost of what they could have done if they didn't buy that off the plan. And that's another thing we see in this segment.
Yeah, and there can be so many delays when it comes to these off the plan purchases being completed. And you might say, okay, well, you know, this one's estimated to be done in a year. That timeline works for me. It means I can save a little bit more and I'm okay with the risks and I'm not in a rush. So, you know, in theory, that could work out for you. But that year could turn into 18 months. It could turn into 2 years. And there's interestingly, many, many years ago, this happened to one of my colleagues. She helped someone purchase a property which was technically off the plan. There was only 2 in the block, and they were just going through the final process. The property had been actually fully built, but they were just waiting on the lodgement of the title, and that actually ended up taking 8 months. That is a process which should have taken a couple of weeks or so, but there was some kind of problem with that, and it took 8 months. So even if that property is fully built, just be aware that there are all of these delays beyond your control, which can impact you.
Yeah, and a lot of people say, well, what I'll do is I'll research the builder and I'll pick the best builder, which absolutely is a great idea. You definitely want to see, you know, how long they've been around, what's their other projects, you know, what experience, what capital have they got, you know, are they a big organization than a small organization? But we can see in even recent years, you know, there's been some massive names that have gone under in the building industry, right, and are unable to complete projects. There was a big one in Sydney recently, like PBS and Porter Davis in the house and land packages. And, you know, one of the big risks with the off the plan sector is that you're reliant on that builder, you know, staying liquid over that time of the build. And, you know, what happens is builders see individual projects as individual companies. And while they may be absolutely winning on this development and this is going really well and they know they're going to make great profits here, some projects can be just really bad apples, I guess. And things can get weather, staffing issues, material problems, council problems, unforeseen just issues with the land. Things can make projects start to run you know, into the negative, into the red, right? And what ends up happening is they start making cutbacks in the materials, they start making cutbacks in the fixtures and fittings because they know they're going to lose money on these projects. And even to a certain extent, they actually, you know, Phoenix, they actually let certain projects go under. And so great builders aren't, you know, the way to get around this problem. It can even have problems that great builders in the off the plan space because each individual project's like an individual business.
Absolutely. And I've seen that happen before with, and just for context, I can help clients purchase off the plan, and I have helped clients purchase off the plan in the past. These have specifically been home buyers who approach me and say, I've found this property. I really, really want it. It suits me. I love it. I want to get into it. And I run through all of the pros and cons with them, and they've ended up making the decision to purchase it. And they've been quite happy with it in the end because they have gone into that eyes wide open. But then I've also heard of some buyers, and I was speaking to someone not long ago where they did all of their due diligence on the builder. They saw previous projects that they had done. They were happy with it. It had come highly recommended for certain people. But that person ended up actually going bust. That building company ended up going bust because they ran into cash flow management issues. They were probably a great builder and they, you know, built a good product, but they weren't able to run the business that well. So, you know, you can do everything right and be an informed, educated buyer when it comes to these things, but there are so many extra layers of risk beyond your control in comparison to purchasing an established property.
Yeah, one of the issues that I find is that, a lot of the buildings built in the last 20, maybe even up to 30 years, there's some significant building issues. You just have to type it into Google, and you'll find how many apartments have got defects, whether it's cladding, whether it's water issues, whether it's fire issues in terms of the way they've done that, etc. So there's lots of issues in a lot of buildings, and and what the problem with buying off the plan is that a building, you don't know how well it's built. You had Opal Tower just a couple of years ago, right? A brand new building, had lots of, and so you didn't know that. So when you signed up that contract for Opal Tower, you thought that building was brand new and there'd be no issues on it. Well, as soon as it got to the other end, there was defects. Those defects have to get fixed, and we all know. Well, we do, but what are some of the issues where people assume that it's got lots of great warranty, but a lot of bigger buildings have less insurance than something like a toaster?
Well, it's more around that there is certainly like statutory warranties in place, like basic consumer warranties when it comes to builders. But the reality is it's easier said than done to pursue them and to be able to recoup costs and to be able to get them to come back to rectify things. So even if you manage to go through that process, it's not going to be out without time and energy and mental cost as well. So when you're buying a brand new property or when you're buying an off the plan property, you can't check the quality of that, and it hasn't had time for those issues to bubble to the surface in comparison to sometimes we'll look at an apartment and it's maybe 5+ years old, and these defects have already been identified by the body corporate and owners corporation, and maybe they've looked into them and figured out a solution. Or I've come across apartment blocks before where they're currently taking action against that builder, but there's no resolution as yet, and sometimes that's been going on for many years. And for me, that's a deal breaker, and that's a red flag.
Yeah, and this isn't just, you don't get these issues just with off the plan, right? You definitely get it when you're buying in the established property market, which is pretty much everything else, right? But you've done your strata report, you've really looked at the building, you've got a building, building and pest inspector to have a look at it potentially. It's in the minutes, you know what the issues are. Now, it's not to say that's foolproof, absolutely. We've got clients who bought into older apartments, and 6 months later, they've figured out there's some water issues that were never in the minutes and were never documented. So you can't, can't avoid all risks, right? But one of the big issues in the off the plan sector is that you're basically buying a building that's untested, and you're reliant on those defects getting fixed, which is reliant on the builder still being in business, which is relying on them also having, different types of insurance, which, bigger builds sometimes don't have. So you just got to be really careful. We've seen that go really wrong for clients. What's your thoughts, Amy, though, ultimately, though, if a client gets through all those decisions, what's your thoughts on the overall asset performance of, more newer builds and off the plan sector?
So when I'm considering the sort of suitability going forward, if it's a home, then of course, you need to ensure that that meets your own accommodation requirements, etc. And maybe it is going to fill in a gap of being able to get you into the suburb that you couldn't have afforded, or you didn't have any options for an established property, and that's okay. But from an investing perspective, or even, as you're purchasing as a home buyer, you should be aware of this as well, because when you are purchasing brand new, in some situations, you might be paying a premium for the newness of it, or the fact that that developer has an amazing marketing budget and they've pitched you the dream, and maybe you've paid a bit of a premium for that. But also when it is, say, part of a very large complex, when you've got no scarcity, when you're one of 100 properties, and then at some point in the future, when time comes to sell, maybe you're competing against 4 or 5 others for sale in that block at that point in time, or even leasing that property out. You're going to have quite a few in that block for lease at once. And I recall many, like back in 2012, when I was working in leasing in Richmond, there were quite a few off the plan blocks that had just settled. And I was taking tenants through 8 or 9 at a time within that block. I was saying, hey, everyone, follow me around. And I was going to all of these ones, and they had too much choice. And it was taking so long to lease those properties out. And also, side note on that, because this is another risk when it comes to off the plan, I remember one of those apartments you walked into, and outside the balcony, directly outside the balcony of the living area, was a big black brick wall. That buyer would not have known that that was going to be the case when it came to purchasing that property. They would have never been okay with that. But that was outside of their control in terms of understanding what their outlook was going to be like. And that property was almost impossible to lease because who would have wanted to live in a house like that? So not having the confidence of knowing exactly what you're buying and what it's looking out on and what's outside your windows, et cetera, who's looking into your windows, all of these are extra layers of risk.
Yeah, absolutely. We find that in the off-the-plan sector is that a lot of the best apartments, the north aspects, the bigger ones, the higher floors, they've all been snapped up, right? And the developers selling it, keeping them, selling it to their family and friends, their close connections, and a lot of the scraps is what gets sold out in the marketplace, right? And who's to know what your view is going to be in 5 years? And one of the things with new property is if they're allowing to build that development, you've got to ask, why wouldn't they not allow other developments to happen around that property? So ultimately, a lot of high density apartments happen in little gluts, no matter what city you're in. And so they've allowed this development to happen. There's also planning approvals. There's land banking going on by lots of other developers. So there's lots of other apartments usually in the queue to be built around you, and who knows what happens. So that's one of the big future risks. So yeah, it settles, but once it's settled, who's to say you don't spend the next 2 years with a construction site next to you? That's definitely what we've seen. Now, even if you buy into the smaller developments, maybe it's a boutique block of 6 townhouses, right, in a middle ring suburb. Ultimately, if they've been able to get that one through council, you've got to ask, are they going to be able to get more through? And so it might be the shortfall of townhouses in the area today, but by the time you've finished, you can see that there's lots of other houses getting knocked down and more townhouses are getting built. So there's a supply issue, not only when you sell your apartment or your townhouse, because more might be available in your block, but there'll be more getting built in your suburb, hence the reason why you've been able to sort of buy this in the first place. The issue you find there is that when you thought it was new, you bought it when you bought it, it was new. But when you're selling it, no longer are the walls all as clean, no longer is the oven brand new, no longer is the style of the building in current trend. New buildings usually age extremely fast. And so what happens is when people buy in the off-the-plan sector, 3, 4, 5, 7 years down the line, they want to upgrade into something else. They go to sell that on the market and they go realize this is an old apartment right now and there's all these new apartments available right now. Why would a buyer spend the same amount of money to buy my apartment when they could buy something new for the same price or a similar price just up the road? And so that's one of the issues with resale value is that your apartment really depreciates while there's new options available around you.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to scarcity, that's a key driver of capital growth or lack of capital growth. Yeah. But also what you just mentioned too, Chris, around lots of other apartments potentially coming up in that area can introduce what's called postcode risk. So when it comes to settle that property, some lenders might have placed a cap on how many properties they are willing to lend to in that particular suburb or even within one block. So just say you're thinking of going with Westpac, but Westpac's only happy to have exposure to a certain number of properties in that particular block, they might not then approve your loan.
Absolutely. It's a very good point you make, Amy. Lenders not only have postcode restrictions, they have actual property limits, right? Because they don't want to be overexposed to certain apartment blocks. And lenders know that the off-the-plan high-density place is higher risk, hence why a lot of them have minimum floor sizes. It might be 50 squares, it might be, but also they'll have, LVR limits. So they might only want to lend up to 80% on the value of properties within certain postcodes or not lend at all. And ultimately, the price of a property is based on how much people buying in that suburb can get access to lending. So their growth is limited because people in that suburb all have to have a 20% deposit versus maybe trying to borrow at 90%. So ultimately, the off-the-plan sector, if you're buying in the high density, you're buying in lots of new townhouses, your growth is generally limited because of those reasons. A, future supply. B, your assets depreciating. The oven's no longer new, the roof's no longer new, and you've got an alternative in that suburb if you wanted to buy new. So people generally want to buy that for the same price. And then you've got other issues on top of that.
And there's just overall less transparency too when it comes to these prices. It can be a lot more challenging to do comparable sales because you might not have access to data of other sales within that block, or even if the developer is sharing that with you, in some instances, there are things happening in the background which you're not aware of. For example, rebates. That developer might sell a property to someone and offer them a $20,000 rebate on settlement. So it looks like on paper that buyer is paid $500,000, but in reality, they've only paid $480,000. But other buyers will look at that thinking they've paid $500,000. So using that as a benchmark, and that's kind of just a tactic that some developers use to kind of artificially inflate the price of those properties. So yeah, it can be more challenging knowing the true value of them and understanding if there were any rebates involved there.
Yeah, so we wouldn't, as a business, work with anyone who sells off the plan. We have gone nowhere near it since I started looking at property back in 2012. I was educated very early on all the risks, and then I've seen thousands of people and their results buying off the plan, right? And very few have done really well. The people who have done well have bought at amazing times and have bought maybe pre a boom. And have locked in a price today, and then the market's boomed, and it wouldn't have been able to enter the market any other way. And so that was a really good decision for them. But a lot of the time it hasn't worked out from a long-term growth point of view. I think you're absolutely right, Amy. The whole world is really murky around property and these selling of these. There's huge commissions to be made for mortgage brokers or buyers agents that sell new property versus actually going and doing the hard yards and going to open homes and negotiating with agents and doing building and pest reports. Buyers agents absolutely deserve their fees for that because they're working absolutely for you. They're not being a front for a developer. So I'd say that, and valuers know this as well. So years down the line when they're valuing properties, they can see that there's some rebates happening. They get valuation issues because they know it's so murky.
And Chris, as a mortgage broker, what's the worst situation that you've potentially seen with one of your clients or have heard about in terms of bank valuation shortfalls?
We've seen quite some big ones. So we would never help encourage a client to sign into an off-the-plan contract. If so, they're a client of ours, we would really educate them of some alternatives and really explain the risks. Some clients have obviously still done it, or clients have come to us and they've already signed a contract, and we'll help them get out of it. Either try to encourage them to get out of the contract, which is really difficult, but if they have to settle, we'll manage the lending for them. It's a real nightmare situation for a broker potentially where you get valuation issues. So going back to a client a couple of years ago, bought an apartment in Ryde. It was for $870. They got a valuation on it $780, right? They had to ask parents. It was a nightmare. It went LMI. It was, and that apartment still is worth less than what they paid. So they still had to pay the developer $870, but they knew straight away this place was only worth less than $800. And valuers, a lot of people say, oh, the broker will just order another valuation with a different bank. Well, yeah, absolutely. We tried that, but we still got low valuations.
It's not the solution, is it? Yeah.
And sometimes we have got clients out of it. So we've got a low valuation and we've ordered another valuation through a different bank, and that bank's come in at contract price. But that's like a cross your finger moment. And that could be the decision of someone having to basically ask their parents and family for money, because if they don't settle, they lose their 10% deposit. And we've seen this also for investors as well. We've seen clients suffer quite big losses, especially in the apartment market in sort of Brisbane, where they may bought at 500 and sold at 420. And they've had to put that debt on their home because that money had to be lost somewhere. So we've also seen issues with building. I've got a client at the moment who signed an off-the-plan contract, bought in the heat of the market of 2021. The builder's basically not building. They're going to keep these apartments because they think, I assume, they're going to be worth more if they just build them and sell them and write out something called the sunset clause.
Let's touch on that, Chris. Let's explain what the sunset clause is, because the legislation is a little bit different here in Victoria to New South Wales.
Yeah, and I think it is a state-based thing. There's lots of things happening in this space to stop this issue. But basically, if the build hasn't finished by a certain date, then the contract's basically ripped up and you get your deposit back. And that is something that you may want to evoke, because you say, well, you promised me that it'd be done in 4 years and it's not. I want my money back. Problem is you've lost 4 years out of the market. And sometimes the developer sort of purposely gets to the end of it and doesn't do it. And then they basically give you a deposit back because they know they could sell it for more money in the marketplace. So that's one of the issues with the sunset. It's meant to protect you as a consumer. But we have had situations where the developer just basically rides it out and then sells them on the market and makes more money that way.
Yeah. And in Victoria, that used to be the case. Fortunately, not anymore, in that the buyer has the option, but no longer the developer, unless they apply via the Supreme Court. So that has helped a little bit, because that was happening so much, especially if the market had increased since, and the developer thought, oh, this is great, I'm just going to cancel that contract and make an even bigger profit. So I guess it's fair to say, Chris, that you and I are both very much on the same page when it comes to off the plan. Not a big fan for various reasons. Absolutely not interested from an investment perspective. But when it comes to buying your own home, and as long as you are going into this with eyes completely wide open and you have an understanding around personal risk, finance risk, you have a lot of backup plans in case things go wrong, it has and can work out for some buyers. But the most important thing is to do as much due diligence as you can beforehand, and just know that is one of the most risky types of property purchases.
And I think what the good news is I think the next generation of off the plan, the standards builders are going to build to, and the quality of what they build is going to be much better than what they've built in the last 20, 30 years. A lot of what they've been building is for investors. Investors want cheap prices, and so they've built cookie cutter, cheap apartments in our capital cities. I think the next round of apartments that are going to be built are for people who are buying homes. They're going to expect a much greater finish, a much better quality, much better management of any defects. There's a lot more spotlight on builders. There's a register, and there's a commissioner in New South Wales. I think the buildings are becoming more sustainable. They're offering there's I think the whole new train is going to get much better options for people, but it doesn't negate all these other risks that we talk about. And potentially you're better off just buying in one of these new buildings once it's built, once you can do a valuation on it, once it's got a track record with the building. You don't have to be the one that takes all the risk and signs the contract. And so this is not against the building or the construction industry. We need more buildings. We've got a rental crisis. We've got high migration, etc. We just believe, as someone who's entering the market, you've just got to be really careful if you can afford to take these financial risks yourself. And the final thing is that the state government and the federal government, to a certain extent, has a huge part to play in this. They incentivize people to buy new property all the time, whether it's first home buyer grants, reductions to stamp duty, etc. What are they giving you those for, these subsidies? It's because the government makes so much money on new builds. They make huge taxes. They make huge taxes on the builder's profits, and development taxes, and GST, etc. So you can be really careful falling for the government incentives, because if you end up getting an extra 25 grand in your pocket, but you end up getting a poor asset that doesn't go up, or goes down, or has some building issues, you're not going to be worried about that 25 grand. So be very careful falling for these government incentives.
Great. I think that's a pretty good summary of everything today, Chris. And if you are even remotely considering off the plan, make sure that you look into it much, much further and have really, really, really thorough chats with your mortgage broker around what could happen when things go wrong. Thanks for your time today, Chris.
Awesome to chat. Thanks, Amy.